Mr. Secretary General, good to see you in Beijing again.
I'm so glad to be back in Beijing.
Since our last talk in Beijing, a lot of things happened. One of those things is the conflicts that's going on right now, both Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East. We see that relevant parties are still trying to struggle with possibilities for ceasefire. From your perspective, how much hope is there?
As you know, as a humanitarian organization, we always keep our hopes high. It's extremely important, and from the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, one of our key asks have been that the parties to the conflict needs to come together and resolve their differences, because in the absence of a political dialogue and a solution, the humanitarian suffering continues. And in Gaza, as we see right now, as we talk, millions of people in dire humanitarian situation. And this is, the humanitarian situation is our major concern at the moment.
And of course, many parties, for example, within the United Nations are calling for ceasefire. Earlier, we also heard from the joint statement between China and France presidents calling for at least Olympic ceasefire during the Olympic times this year. So how much momentum do you see it can be for an organization like yours to work with relevant parties to bring some better results?
You know, as a Red Cross Red Crescent, our focus is really on the humanitarian side. We are not involved on the political negotiations. But of course, we urge that these negotiations succeed purely from the point of view of a humanitarian purpose. I think the suffering has been huge, and in some places there are even reports of starvation. The health system has basically collapsed. The access to different parts of Gaza is extremely difficult or not available. And as the conflict escalates to Rafah area, Rafah border area, the supply gets also disrupted. And that's basically where our current focus is. But we do agree that in the long run, there will have to be a political solution.
Of course, this year we see half of the world's population are going through national elections of one sort or another. And therefore, politically and geopolitically, things are very complicated. So whether any solution is on the horizon soon for the rest of the year is a big question mark, of course. So that puts the question to organizations like yours. How much do you need to back up your preparation right now to deal with particularly the biggest crisis in Russia, Ukraine, and also in the Middle East? Of course, you already have the other crisis going on for years, if not decades.
I think you put a very important point here. Of course, the global attention and focus is on this crisis. But there are multiple other crises in the world which are not talked about. If we look at Sudan, for example, it's generally not much on the news, but there is also a major internal conflict happening between the two sides. And in some of the other contexts I mentioned earlier, there hasn't been, solutions haven't been found. So in this context, organizations like mine and many other humanitarian organizations are in a situation where they are constantly responding, but at the same time preparing for any other crisis to happen. But we also need to be extremely mindful, and for my organization, because we focus on crises which are not conflict related, we cannot forget those crises also. So I think as a humanitarian organization, we are in this a constant response mode, while also required to prepare for unforeseen disasters. And this is putting an enormous pressure on the global humanitarian system. And this pressure cannot be sustained in the long run if there are no solutions to be found. I mean, the climate crisis, if we talk about, it's one of the fundamental crises the world is facing today. I mean, if we just look back last 12 months, look at the weather pattern anywhere in the world, it doesn't resemble to anything even we experienced. And it's creating a multiple impact on human life. You know, climate and health, climate and food security, climate and water, its impact there, climate and energy. So these are multiple issues that are impacting the people living in vulnerable settings. So at the moment, being humanitarian is not an easy time for the humanitarians.
For about the climate change that you just mentioned, we saw the COP meetings. Last year, for example, has been one of those sustained success, shall we put it that way, diplomatically. But how much it is putting into concern the humanitarian side of dealing with the consequences and preparations from a humanitarian side as well?
I think particularly the last COP in Dubai brought much more attention on the humanitarian consequences of the climate crisis. So in many ways, there was a good progress. Now, the challenge is how do we get those negotiations and turn them into action on the ground where people are actually living. The second aspect, which is also lagging behind, is funding. Because whenever you have any decision or resolution, to operationalize that requires funding. And this has been one of the big asks from my organization, is that how do we get the funding channeled to the communities and the countries which need it the most. I was recently in Malawi and I had a chance to talk to the climate minister there, and one of his main concerns was the climate funding is not sufficiently reaching the communities who need it the most. They are trying their best. But the first thing is the amount available is not enough. The second thing is, even when it is available, the flow of funding is not reaching the local community level. And this is one of our major asks globally, has been to channel the right level of resources reaching the people at the community level.
So specifically, which role are you looking at in terms of China?
I think China can play an important role in multiple fronts. One is clearly in the COP process negotiations to continue to advance the discussions towards limiting emissions and advancing that debate. I think China has a very, very important role to play. But equally on the adaptation discussion, because in many parts of the world, the climate change has already happened. People are already affected. So that means we have to help those people to be able to adapt to the climate change that has already happened. And I think the China can play an important role, and I know China is already playing those roles through, of course, the Global Development Initiative, but also it's an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But I think some of these could be scaled up. Equally important is the technology transfer, particularly to the countries in the Global South, where the countries do not have accessible and affordable technology. And that's where I think China can play a very, very important role. In one of the discussions, I heard the term of technology of apartheid, meaning that the technology is not being shared. And it's extremely important that because we live in a global village, climate change impacts every part of the world.
There's some rhetorical war going on right now. I'm sure you're aware of that in terms of green technologies and the application of green technologies. The new energy vehicle is an interesting example. While the world is in urgent need of large amount of new energy vehicles, we see acquisitions against major producers and technology innovators such as China for so-called overcapacity. Of course, we understand there's a lot of geopolitics and also national rivalry involved. But certainly those who, from China's perspective, spread these fake rhetorics are having tremendous amount of rhetorical power in the world. How do you work with what you believe is right for the common cause of the public, especially from the developing and the vulnerable groups?
I think this links to my earlier comment that having differences is, I think, quite normal in the world, and having differences of opinion is absolutely normal. What is needed is when there is a difference of opinions, difference of ideas, that people come together, sit and discuss. And I think my belief is when people sit together and discuss, there is always a solution. There is always a solution. Somebody says, there is no problem. The problem doesn't exist if there is no solution. But that's what is lacking in today's world. When you talk to the issues of the climate or the conflict or many other or trade disputes, and right now, the disputes around the pandemic treaty, the global discourse is very much in not talking when you disagree. Right. And that needs to change. Lack of those discussions and dialogue is increasing the humanitarian consequences. And humanitarian organizations are somehow expected to take the increased caseload without increase on the resources. And in some places, particularly in the conflict context, without proper access and safety and security. As you know, only in Gaza crisis, we have lost more than 30 staff and volunteers.
It's unprecedented.
It's unprecedented. So that's where somehow, I don't know how, I don't know what the magic formula is, but that dialogue, political dialogue, is critically important. And that is also true to the business dialogue. That's the true to technology dialogue. And if there are differences, and there are differences are bound to happen. But sitting together and discussing and at least coming to a meeting point is critically important. Especially the Global South, which needs the technology badly. And I believe China can play a very important role to be that connector and the power which promotes dialogue and discussions and invite people to sit on the table and not outside the table.
What is the role that South-South are likely to play? How do you see China could work with the South countries, the Global South so-called, and be able to at least bring some kinds of consensus despite of the challenges coming from some countries for not encouraging so?
My belief is China needs to do both. China needs to engage with the North, China needs to engage with the South. I believe that China is in a unique position, being the world's second largest economy of 1.4 billion people, I think highly educated workforce. I think it can be that force, that can be the bridge between the developed economies and the developing economies. And I think, I hope and I believe that China can play that role. Of course, for the developing economies, they do need access to the technology without too much restriction, because their ability to meet with those restrictions are also limited. And I think that's where I believe China can play a very important role.
That is the dilemma, that do you need to wait until everything perfect to take action?
No.
Or you try to cope with the current realities to the extent that you can and bring the result as closer to the goal as possible.
I think probably the best approach is to accelerate. I think I have already seen in China and India the progress you have made on the solar energy, for example, or the wind energy, for example. And then the costs have been brought down massively because of these two countries. And what it shows is that you can accelerate. And I think the ask from the organization like myself is, if we already know this is working, means we must accelerate these things. And if we say we can do it by 2050, I think we should target to make it 2035.
Now we have international mechanisms, whether it is UN or WTO or even COP, being weakened as a result of geopolitics and fragmentations. So some of the earlier agreed upon mechanism do not work as much as anymore. Secondly, there seems to be some kinds of frustration and also intellectual refusal about globalization, which is a consensus reached earlier by the world decades ago, and led to prosperity for some years. Of course, there were side effects. So how do you make sure at this point what you have suggested can be done?
You know, for me, ultimately, you know, these global agreements and the global platforms exist. It's very, very important because they provide a strong impetus. But at the end of the day, the action happens at the country level. I think each government,
and even local level,
much more at the local level. I think the city mayors are actually a big actors in transforming the climate action. So, and in my view, this is in the interest of each of the countries to advance it. As I said, the impact of climate on health, that people's health means the cost on the health-related cost, in the people's productivity, the new diseases. So you can imagine if we don't address the climate crisis, its impact just on health can actually massively impact countries' economy. Sure. You know, just one example. Right. So meaning that it is in the interest of each country to address the climate issue from the angle of water, food, health, energy, and I think and livelihood. If we take into these 4 or 5 aspects, and sometimes maybe even take the politics out of it, because it makes economic sense, it makes development sense, it makes health sense. Frankly, if we take the politics out, it makes sense to address the climate crisis, use the new technology, accelerate some of the action. And that's where I think the national governments and the local governments needs to take a lead, irrespective of the global platform, which I know are very, very important. But the national governments can make a difference, as China has already made.
Jagan, once again, what a pleasure to see you back in Beijing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and always great to talk to you.